door shut downstairs, and him a-working oop in the dark. Slow and steady, I says to myself. Tak your time, sir, no hurry. He comes to the door, turns the key when there warn't nothing to hold the lock, and calls out, "Hallo there!" Yes, thinks I. You may do that again and not whacking anybody, sir. "Hallo there!" he says, and then he stops. "Thou'd better not aggravate me," says schoolmaster after a little time. "I'll break every bone in your body, Smike," he says, after another little time. Then all of a sudden he sings out for a light, and when it comes, it caught such a hurly-burly. "What's the matter?" says I. "He's gane," says he, stark mad with vengeance. "Have you ear naught?" "Yes," says I. "I heard street door shut no time at all ago. I heard a person run down there," pointing to other way, eh? "Help," he cries. "I'll help you," says I, and off we set, the wrong way. Ho, ho, ho! "Did you go far?" asked Nicholas. "Far," replied John. "I run him clean off his legs in quarter of an hour. To see old schoolmaster without his hat, skimming along up to his knees in mud and water, tumbling over fences and rolling into ditches, and bawling out like mad with his one eye looking sharp out for the lad, and his coat-tails flying out behind, and him spattered with mud all o'er, face and all. I thought I should ha' dropped down and killed myself with laughing." John laughed so heartily at the mere recollection that he communicated the contagion to both his hearers, and all three burst into peals of laughter, which were renewed again and again, until they could laugh no longer. "He's a bad un," said John, wiping his eyes. "A very bad un, is schoolmaster." "I can't bear the sight of him, John," said his wife. "Come," retorted John, "that's tidying you, that is. If it warn't along o' you, we shouldn't know naught aboot un. Thou knowed un first, Tilly, didn't thou?" "I couldn't help knowing Fanny Squeers, John," returned his wife. "She was an old playmate of mine, you know." "Well," replied John, "daren't I say so, lass? It's best to be neighbourly and to keep up old acquaintance like. And what I say is, daren't quarrel if he can help it. Do not think so, Mr. Nickleby?" "Certainly," returned Nicholas. "And you acted upon that principle when I met you on horseback on the road after our memorable evening." "Surely," said John. "What I say I stick by." "And that's a fine thing to do, and manly too," said Nicholas, "though it's not exactly what we understand by coming Yorkshire over us in London. Miss Squeers is stopping with you, you said in your note." "Yes," replied John. "Tilly's bridesmaid, and a queer bridesmaid she be too. She won't be a bride in a hurry, I reckon." "For shame, John," said Mrs. Brodie, with an acute perception of the joke, though, being a bride herself. "The groom'll be a blessed man," said John, his eyes twinkling at the idea. "He'll be in luck, he will." "You see, Mr. Nickleby," said his wife, "that it was in consequence of her being here that John wrote to you and fixed tonight, because we thought that it wouldn't be pleasant for you to meet after what has passed." "Unquestionably. You were quite right in that," said Nicholas, interrupting. "Especially," observed Mrs. Brodie, looking very sly, "after what we know about past and gone love matters." "We know indeed," said Nicholas, shaking his head. "You behaved rather wickedly there, I suspect." "O' course she did," said John Brodie, passing his huge forefinger through one of his wife's pretty ringlets and looking very proud of her. "She were always as skittish and full of tricks as a—" "Well, as a what?" said his wife. "As a woman," returned John. "Ding, but I do not know what else that comes near it." "You were speaking about Miss Squeers," said Nicholas, with the view of stopping some slight connubialities which had begun to pass between Mr. and Mrs. Brodie, and which rendered the position of a third party in some degree embarrassing, as occasioning him to feel rather in the way than otherwise. "Oh, yes," rejoined Mrs. Brodie. "John had done. John fixed tonight because she had settled that she would go and drink tea with her father, and to make quite sure of there being nothing amiss, and of your being quite alone with us, he settled to go out there and fetch her home." "That was a very good arrangement," said Nicholas. though I am sorry to be the occasion of so much trouble." "Not the least in the world," returned Mrs. Brodie. "For we have looked forward to see you, John and I have, with the greatest possible pleasure. Do you know, Mr. Nickleby," said Mrs. Brodie, with her archest smile, "that I really think Fanny Squeers was very fond of you?" "I am very much obliged to her," said Nicholas, "but upon my word I never aspired to making any impression upon her virgin heart." "How you talk!" tittered Mrs. Brodie. "No, but do you know that really? Seriously now, and without any joking? I was given to understand by Fanny herself that you had made an offer to her, and that you two were going to be engaged quite solemn and regular." "Was you, ma'am? Was you?" cried a shrill female voice. "Was you given to understand that I was going to be engaged to an assassinating thief that shed the gore of my paw? Do you think, ma'am, that I was very fond of such dirt beneath my feet, as I couldn't condescend to touch with kitchen tongs, without blacking and crocking myself by the contract? Do you, ma'am? Do you? Oh, base and degrading Tilda!" With these reproaches, Miss Squeers flung the door wide open, and disclosed to the eyes of the astonished Brodies and Nicholas not only her own symmetrical form, arrayed in the chaste white garments before described, a little dirtier, but the form of her brother and father, the pair of Wackfords. "This is the hend, is it?" continued Miss Squeers, who, being excited, aspirated her H's strongly. "This is the hend, is it, of all my forbearance and friendship for that double-faced thing, that viper, that mermaid?" Miss Squeers hesitated a long time for this last epithet, and brought it out triumphantly at last, as if it quite clinched the business. "This is the hend, is it, of all my bearing with her deceitfulness, her lowness, her falseness, her laying herself out to catch the admiration of vulgar minds in a way which made me blush for my "Gender?" suggested Mr. Squeers, regarding the spectators with a malevolent eye. Literally, a malevolent eye. "Yes," said Miss Squeers, "but I think my stars and my ma is of the same—" "Hear, hear," remarked Mr. Squeers, "and I wish she was here to have a scratch at this company."
"This is the hend, is it?"
said Miss Squeers, tossing her head and looking contemptuously at the floor.
"Of my taking notice of that rubbishing creature, and demeaning myself to patronize her?"
"Oh, come," rejoined Mrs. Brodie, disregarding all the endeavours of her spouse to restrain her, and forcing herself into a front row. "Don't talk such nonsense as that."
"Have I not patronized you, ma'am?"
demanded Miss Squeers. "No," returned Mrs. Brodie.
"I will not look for blushes in such a quarter,"
said Miss Squeers haughtily,
"for that countenance is a stranger to everything but ignominiousness and red-faced boldness."
"I say," interposed John Brodie, nettled by these accumulated attacks on his wife, "draw it mild, draw it mild."
"You, Mr. Brodie,"
said Miss Squeers, taking him up very quickly,
"I pity. I have no feeling for you, sir, but one of unliquidated pity."
"Oh!" said John.
"No,"
said Miss Squeers, looking sideways at her parent.
"Although I am a queer bridesmaid, and shan't be a bride in a hurry, and although my husband will be in luck, I entertain no sentiments towards you, sir, but sentiments of pity."
Here Miss Squeers looked sideways at her father again, who looked sideways at her, as much as to say, "There you had him."
"I know what you've got to go through,"
said Miss Squeers, shaking her curls violently.
"I know what life is before you, and if you was my bitterest and deadliest enemy, I could wish you nothing worse."
"Couldn't you wish to be married to him yourself, if that was the case?" inquired Mrs. Brodie, with great suavity of manner.
"Oh, ma'am, how witty you are!"
retorted Miss Squeers, with a low curtsy.
"Almost as witty, ma'am, as you are clever. How very clever it was in you, ma'am, to choose a time when I had gone to tea with my pa, and was sure not to come back without being fetched. What a pity you never thought that other people might be as clever as yourself and spoil your plans."
"You won't vex me, child, with such airs as these," said the late Miss Price, assuming the matron.
"Don't Mrs. me, ma'am, if you please,"
returned Miss Squeers sharply.
I'll not bear it.